We are going to go ahead and get started for today. Thank you so much for joining our 2022 legislative briefing, Prospects for the Pro-Housing Agenda. We are so excited to be joined today by Senator John Keenan and Representative James Arciero, along with Representative Andy Vargas. My name is Cassie Infante. I am the statewide organizer for Abundant Housing Massachusetts, and I'm so excited to help facilitate today's conversation. And so before we get started, I do want to share a few announcements and outline our event agenda. And so currently we are recording this event to also be streamed live on our Abundant Housing Massachusetts YouTube channel. And the agenda for our event is that we're going to spend around 30 to 40 minutes in a moderated discussion with our panelists. We're then going to spend the final 10 minutes together in a moderated Q&A section. And so as you have questions come up for you throughout this event, please submit those in the Q&A section, and we will do our absolute best to answer the questions in the order in which they are received. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So please feel free to utilize the Q&A function in this Zoom webinar. And so without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Abundant Housing's Executive Director, Jessie Kansan-Benanov, to lead this afternoon's panel. And so Jessie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cassie. I appreciate that introduction. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. My name is Jessie Kansan-Benanov. As Cassie said, I'm the Executive Director of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. Abundant Housing Massachusetts is an organization, for those of you who don't know, that was founded in 2020. We believe that Massachusetts is for everyone. Our mission is to stand up for abundant housing for all in communities across Massachusetts. We drive policy at the state and local level by identifying pro-housing changemakers, building the power of local organizers, and connecting a statewide pro-housing network. I'm really excited about today's event, this being our first legislative briefing for our members and supporters as an organization. And I'm going to introduce our panelists in a moment, starting with Rep. Vargas. But before I do that, I want to explain a little bit about our legislative agenda, which we recently unveiled as an organization. Cassie, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So our policy agenda, you can see in the lower right-hand corner there, is on our website, abundanthousingma.org. And I encourage you to read that because it's broader than what we've been able to include just on these slides. Our policy agenda is split into sort of three categories of bills, focusing on the first being a focus on production and zoning reform to make sure we can build the homes that we need to affordably house everyone who lives and wants to live in Massachusetts. Our top priority fits under that category, which is the focus of today's conversation, House Bill 1448, Senate Bill 871, an act relative to housing production. And we'll have a conversation with Representative Vargas, who's one of the main sponsors of that bill, about that. The next category, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, is the area of desegregation. It's well known that Massachusetts communities are incredibly segregated by race, by class and income, and by other categories. And so we need to make sure that while we are building and zoning for a diverse future, that the regulations and policies that we adopt on the local and state levels help encourage integration at all levels in housing, in education, and in other areas. And then finally, the third category is in the tenant protection and stabilization area. This is critical to making sure that we have stable, abundant housing for everyone. Our top priorities include the Homes Act, which is not actually before the Housing Committee, whose chairs will have speak in this event, but that's eviction ceiling and reforming the eviction process in Massachusetts. The two bills that are pending before the Housing Committee are the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and the Right to Counsel Act. All three of these are key components of our tenant protection agenda. Again, there are more bills that we've endorsed in all areas production and zoning reform, desegregation, and tenant protection. And I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about that agenda. Again, our focus today is on House Bill 1448, sponsored by Representative Vargas. And I'm going to have Representative Vargas turn on his camera and join us to tell us a little bit about that piece of legislation, which is also in the Senate as Senate Bill 871. Before I go, I just want to make sure everyone knows that Representative Vargas represents the 3rd Essex District in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. That is the city of Haverhill. He serves as Vice Chair of the Economic Development and Emerging Technologies Committee, and is also a member of Ways and Means, Education, Public Health and Redistricting, and is a member of the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislative Caucus. He's a good friend of Abundant Housing, and we're very glad to have him join us today. Welcome, Representative Vargas.
Thank you so much, Jesse, and thank you, Cassie, and the entire crew at Abundant Housing for all the work that you continue to do to promote housing here in the Commonwealth and make sure that we have enough of it for everyone to have a roof over their heads. And thank you especially to the 2 chairs of the Housing Committee, my friends, Chairman Keenan and Chairman Arciero. Thank you so much for taking the time to join today with 82 participants on Tuesday at 12 p.m. Congratulations to Abundant Housing on such a great turnout here today. Housing continues to be the #1 priority and issue in my office, and I know that that's the case for many of my colleagues in the legislature. There's literally not a week that goes by that there's not a housing constituent case that we literally cannot solve. And I mean, you know, a family that's in a hotel that can't find a unit, a family that perhaps is a first-time home buyer but can't compete in this market, and they've had their down payment ready to go for a while now but just can't compete. Or someone who's just looking for affordable housing as well. It's across the spectrum. We see these challenges in our district, and it's so important for us to center housing as not only a solution for housing, of course, but also an economic justice solution, a climate justice solution, a transportation solution. This is all intersectional across many different issue areas that we're all trying to address here. So I'm really grateful that, you know, Abundant Housing has this convening power and is able to bring people together to have conversations around a very important topic that is central to our recovery and also building a society that is more inclusive and stronger by ensuring that we're undoing some of the malpractice that has happened around housing and zoning in generations past. And for any of the 85 folks here that haven't read The Color of Law, I highly recommend it. I know it's pretty cliche to recommend it at this point, but it is probably my favorite book that I read in 2019. Please do read it if you haven't read it. It'll get you fired up about this stuff. I'll be very brief around the bill and make sure that we get to our esteemed guests, the 2 chairmen of the Housing Committee, and just briefly run down what H 1448 does. The goal of this bill was really to build on what we did last session around the housing production bill that we passed, which was sort of a similar version to the housing choice legislation that the governor has filed with a few changes that we had in the legislature. And the idea is that we need to do more to make sure that we're producing housing faster. Yes, there are all sorts of things that we need to do to provide immediate relief to folks, but the long-term game is we need to ensure that there's a better balance between the supply and demand scale. And so the components of the bill include establishing a statewide housing production goal of 427,000 new units by 2040. It's as simple as saying, you know, we value what we measure, right? If we're not measuring or coming up with a goal, then how do we know we're doing well? And so we want to make sure that our executive branch is coming up with a goal that we can then hold ourselves accountable for. The second piece of this is in the bill requires multifamily zoning around transit and other suitable locations in all municipalities statewide. So as you know, we did MBTA zoning in the past bill, but that doesn't include, you know, our regional transit authorities or ferry terminals, and other transit stops and nodes that are really important. So we want to make sure that zoning districts would be required within a half mile of commuter rail, subway, ferry, or bus stations, and within a quarter mile of a stop along a bus route, rapid transit route, commuter rail route. And so this is encouraging more transit-oriented development, which we know is not only just good for housing, but good for our downtowns, good for our small businesses as well that benefit from that kind of foot traffic and density. The bill also legalizes accessory dwelling units, ADUs, to be built by right in every municipality. ADUs, and some examples of these are, in-law apartments, accessory apartments, would be made legal, expanding the pool of housing available, particularly for low-income people, and would provide additional income for existing homeowners without needing to develop additional housing. And so this capitalizes on larger housing units that already exist. And by the way, it also addresses another issue that is near and dear to many of us, which is that we have an aging population here in the Commonwealth, and we need to make sure that we're providing the housing necessary for that. And case in example is my grandmother's 91 years old, lives with my parents, and they're having a challenge with housing right now, and senior housing is incredibly expensive. And so by providing the ability to do ADUs in a responsible manner across the Commonwealth, we can immediately add stock that can help alleviate some of that demand. The bill also deals with inclusionary zoning. As you know, inclusionary zoning wasn't one of the things that we changed to a simple majority in that last bill that we passed in the legislature. And so it'll be super important for us to ensure that we're adding inclusionary zoning bylaws to the list of zoning changes that may be enacted with a simple majority vote. And that'll improve the availability of low-income housing units across the state. I mean, we're one of the few states that still allows or requires a 2/3 majority for this type of zoning change. And then finally, two other smaller portions of the bill. One would be allowing commercial properties that have been vacant for at least 2 years to be allowed to be used for mixed use and multifamily housing. We know that with this pandemic, there have been some commercial properties that perhaps aren't coming back while the demand for housing continues to increase. And so we should get innovative and explore different ways to repurpose that commercial space into where the demand is, which right now is in housing. And then lastly, would prioritize the disposition of state-owned land to be used for affordable housing as well. So that's the overview of the bill.
That's great. Thank you, Representative. I appreciate it. I want to make sure we do bring the co-chairs in a moment, but just a couple of follow-up questions for you, some that we got when people registered ahead of time, and some similar ones that have already come through the chat. As you mentioned, the multifamily zoning component of this bill is similar to, although expands upon, the MBTA community's requirement of housing choice that was passed in the last session. And obviously those draft guidelines have been released by DHCD. We at Abundant Housing, I know other advocates are doing our best to understand exactly what it all means for those guidelines. But I think there is a concern that it will be fairly easy for some suburban communities to not comply with the MBTA community's upzoning requirement, because the only consequence is ineligibility for certain funds like MassWorks, which they don't, some of them don't utilize anyways. So that's been a concern with regards to that bill. Can you address how 1448, if passed, would address that situation, and what happens for communities that are impacted but don't adopt multifamily zoning in compliance with the law?
Yeah, and this is part of the challenge, right? And we're still examining what the effects and the impact were of that bill that we passed last session. I always say that the unexamined law is not worth passing. So we're still examining and seeing what the impact is going to be on that, and reviewing DHCD's regulations as well, and providing comment on them as well. I mean, look, the bottom line is any way that we can further incentivize or provide a stick for communities to make sure that they're doing their fair share in terms of housing production, we should absolutely pursue that. MassWorks is an incredibly important program, and it remains to be seen whether or not that'll be enough to keep communities from not complying with the regulations that are in place. And so we'll just have to keep a close eye on what the impact is of the bill that we just passed, and if necessary, explore other ways to make sure that we're either incentivizing or providing enough of a stick to make sure that communities are complying with the law.
And I would add, if I am not mistaken, there is a provision under 1448, which if adopted, would say in communities that don't comply, non-compliant zoning is essentially invalidated, and you can then build multifamily housing that complies with the law in those districts.
Right. So thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries. So I wanted to make sure we get that in because I know that's been a concern and a question from our folks. Is there going to be any opportunity to incentivize communities to act, or should we think about future legislative changes to actually not just give the mandate, but additional incentives to build multifamily housing? I don't know if that's something you've thought about, but it is a question that's come up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are ways to work with the executive branch to make sure that communities that are doing this right and doing it, quickly get priority for grants, whether it's, MassWorks or other DHCD products that can give them extra points on a grant application, for example. Those are things that I think, are good carrots that can incentivize a community to move in the right direction.
Great. Thank you. Is there anything else you want to add about 1448? Do you want to mention any other important pieces of legislation that you've been supporting this session before we go on to the co-chairs?
No, let's go straight to the co-chairs. I think, look, the bottom line is there's a lot that we have to do on housing. This is just one bill and one framework that we've prioritized this session and seen as a great next step to the housing production bill that passed last session, but there's a variety of tools that we're going to have to throw at this problem, and it's not a problem that's going to be solved from one session to the other. It takes a collaborative approach across the spectrum, from housing advocates, from renters, from homeowners, from developers, from everybody. We have to find a way forward together to make sure that we're producing the right number of units annually, and that we're getting people into safe, stable, and decent housing, because that's what everyone in the Commonwealth deserves.
Thank you, Representative Vargas. Stick around with us. I'm going to invite the co-chairs of the Joint Committee on Housing to turn on their cameras and join us now. I'm really honored that we are joined by Senator John Keenan, who represents the Norfolk and Plymouth District, which includes the city of Quincy, towns of Abington, Braintree, Holbrook, and Rockland. He's in his 6th term and currently serves, as I said, as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing, and is also Vice Chair of the Joint Committee on Transportation. We are also joined by State Representative James Arcero, who serves the 2nd Middlesex District in the House of Reps, the State House. He represents the precincts in the town of Chelmsford, as well as the towns of Littleton and Westford, and he is the House Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing. So welcome. I see Senator Keenan, and certainly invite Representative Arcero to turn on his camera when possible. Fantastic.
Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries.
Here's from the ether.
We're getting better at it, Jesse. We'll get there.
Yeah, no, that's great. I know it's the Zoom world we're living in. We're still all adjusting to it now, 2 years later or whatever. So I really appreciate you both taking the time to join us. I know there's a busy time at the legislature right now with the Joint Rule 10 deadline coming up on February 2nd. So again, thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I want to start. I guess I'll start with Senator Keenan, and then go to Representative Arcero, and then I'll switch it up for the next question. But I wanted to give you both an opportunity to give a general response to Representative Vargas's bill, H 1448, and in the Senate by Senator Creighton, 871. I don't want to pin you down too much. I know there's a lot of work going on in the committee right now to figure out how a housing agenda will proceed, but would love to hear your general thoughts. What are you excited about? What are you concerned about? How do you respond to this bill? And again, I'll start with you, Senator Keenan.
Great. Well, thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Cassie, for having us today. Thanks to Abundant Housing for all the work that you're doing. It's great to see Co-Chair Rep. Arcero. Great to see you. And Rep. Vargas, thank you for your work on this bill. The bill is an exciting bill because it really brings focus to the issue of housing. And in the one of the early sections of the bill, they talk about the goal of how many units of housing we should build. I think it's 427,000 units of housing by 2040. That's pretty ambitious given the issues that we've had, or the difficulties we've had in developing housing over the last couple of decades. But I think if we don't set a goal like that and then don't tie to it some affordable housing sub goals, I think we lose focus. And so I think the bill does a great job of making sure that we keep the production of housing as one of our focuses. And it covers a broad array of approaches. And some of it has been done through the MBTA communities, but the bill also adds in an affordability component to that, which I think is important. And just as a quick example, in my community of Quincy, we had an MBTA parking lot where a developer entered a long-term lease with the MBTA to develop the parking lot. And there will be 600 plus units. There'll be some commercial space. There's already a Target that's opened. The units are filling up quickly, but one of my concerns with that project was that there wasn't an affordable component to it. And yet here it is, literally built over the North Quincy MBTA parking lot and train station. And it's a perfect place to have affordable housing in the mix. So I think we have to make sure that as we move forward, there is a focus on including affordable housing within the MBTA communities, within the half mile of some of these transit hubs. So I think that's a really great focus of the bill. And one of the other things that is in the bill that we don't talk, I don't think, enough about is the idea of housing for people over 55. Mm-hmm. There's an enormous need for that in the district that I represent, and I think all across the Commonwealth. And not only is there a need to provide housing for people as they come of that age, but it is a housing on a continuum. So for every person, for instance, on my street, there's a woman who lives up the street who has just gone into a nursing home. She's lived in a 3-bedroom home by herself for many years. For every time that somebody is able to transition into an over 55 housing situation, a house in a neighborhood somewhere opens up for a family. And so I think the inclusion of that language in this bill about housing for people over 55 is really important, and making sure that it's affordable is critical as well. So there's a lot of good things in this bill. And again, I think it gives us the focus that we need as we move forward. The other one of the components that's in here is ADU, something that is becoming a topic of much conversation, not only here in Massachusetts and the Northeast, but earlier on throughout the rest of the country. And while there has been a hesitation to look at ADUs, when I was on the city council in Quincy, we looked at it and we never quite came to the point where we permitted them. I think that's one of the components of meeting the housing demand. And we have many bills that are on our committee that deal with ADUs, and we'll sort through and determine whether those bills are ready for any sort of action. So I'm excited about the bill and the prospects for what it can, how it can focus us. And just one final point of the bill is they talk about vacant commercial spaces in communities that, if they have been vacant for 2 years, can then be used for mixed use for residential and commercial. And that's important. A lot of communities have crossover zoning, but not all. And so I think looking at that from a statewide approach is something that we should do as well. And just to wrap up, this past weekend, my wife and I went out to visit my son out in Milwaukee, where he goes to school at Marquette University, and took the opportunity on Saturday to go down and visit Burnham Block. Burnham Block is a block of 6 homes that were built by Frank Lloyd Wright in the 1930s. And at the time, they were built on the edge, the southwestern edge of the city of Milwaukee. And land was cheap, so these homes were built. The goal was to provide good housing, 1-story housing or 2-story housing if it was a duplex, in as affordable a way as possible so that working people could buy these homes. And at that point, where they were built was literally right on the edge of cow pastures. And now it's within a busy part of Milwaukee. And so when I thought of that, that's a long time. That number of years to go from the concept to then the city developing around these homes is too long. And it highlighted to me 2 things. One, the idea of affordable, creative housing in our communities is something that has been around a long time. I saw that with these homes, but also we can't wait as long as it's taken for the community to wrap around and to come to those homes. We've got to do a better job of making sure that we're developing these types of homes within our community. Some go vertical, some will go horizontal, but we've got to do a better job overall. So I'm excited about the prospects of housing here in the Commonwealth. I'm excited to be part of the discussion, and I want to thank Rep. Vargas and Senator Crichton for bringing this bill forward. It just prompts so many great ideas, and looking forward to moving and implementing as many of those as we possibly can. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Keenan. I appreciate it. And, Rep. Arciero, what are you excited about? What do you think about this bill or prospects for it?
Well, thank you. This being my first chairmanship after being a long time aide in the building, both in the House and the Senate, and being a legislator for about 14 years, it's been a very exciting journey so far. To me, Jesse, and thank you for having myself and my colleague, Representative Vargas, for all the work that he's done, and of course my co-chair and good friend, Senator Keaton. It's key to addressing our housing issues is really it's housing production. It's central to addressing the needs for the demand of housing. As chair, my first chair, I was conduct a number of tours. Myself and Senator Keenan have gone crisscross the state to cities of Lowell, Jamaica Plain, Hyde Park, Cape, Worcester, Springfield, Chelmsford. I know Dave Hedison's watching today, so I'll throw a shout out to him. And we have scheduled tours in Cambridge, Norwood, Pittsfield, and Amherst. And the focus of these tours was to sort of assess the unique challenges faced by different communities in providing a safe and affordable housing for the residents. And this year in the House of Representatives, which is certainly an historic moment, is that we invested $600 million towards housing production and recently passed ARPA bill back in November. Some of the highlights were $150 million towards supportive housing, $150 million for public housing maintenance, $100 million towards home ownership assistance, as well as $100 million in affordable housing production and $100 million in the Commonwealth Builder Program. But when I first started as a chair and crisscrossing the state on some of these things, my first stop was Cape Cod. And so meeting with Representative Kip Diggs and touring Hyannis, the major challenge that we first heard certainly was ADUs and affordability in the Cape. And these were things that were echoed in a lot of the cities that we had visited. On top of that, I think it would be the piece of setting an affordable housing goal for production, how you have here at 427,000. In some ways, and I've talked to Andy about this before, I look at this, and Senator Keenan and I had this conversation, as actually creating the roadmap for housing. I think that's a brand that we could look at. I think it's been a challenge for chairs over the decades here in the legislature to really get their arms around one particular affordable housing goal that you're trying to reach. And I think for myself as a new chair, pieces of legislation like this that touch all the pieces of affordable housing is critically important for us to use, I would say, as a roadmap to move forward for housing production and affordable housing for all throughout the Commonwealth. One piece that I think hasn't been talked too much in detail, but it's very interesting, and there's a number of bills, we have 150 bills that are in our committee, would be the provision, Andy's Representative Vargas's legislation on the Grayfields Commission. This is something that we heard a lot in Worcester and Holyoke, and it's essentially finding ways to use underutilized land that the state may have for affordable housing purposes. So I applaud Representative Vargas and Senator Crichton for all the work on this piece of legislation. Again, I think it hits a lot of the points that are important for us to move forward on providing more housing for the Commonwealth. And I look forward to working with the representative and the senator on Joint Rule 10 and discussions on moving this bill forward.
Thank you, Representative. I want to ask you both, and in a couple minutes we'll get to some of the questions that were submitted and that are still coming in. But can you, and I'll start with you, Representative Arciero, describe what's the next steps here? Recognizing we're a new organization, a lot of our folks have been working in their own communities over the years, but not necessarily engaging on Beacon Hill. So Rep. Vargas has this great bill. There's so many components of it that we've already talked about. February 2nd, I believe, is the Joint Rule 10 deadline for bills to be reported favorably out of committee. What's the step both from now till then to get this bill to that point? Is there the prospect that only pieces of it will be incorporated into other legislation? What does that look like? What can our members expect over the next couple of weeks?
Thanks, Jesse. So currently, right now, the senator and I are continuing, and it's been a crazy couple of weeks, but we're continuing our discussions on making determinations for both branches on our Joint Rule 10 Day coming up on February 2nd. Where pieces of legislation are going to move, whether they're going to be favorable, whether they're going to be ought not to pass, whether they're going to be put into a study for additional research, et cetera, or extended for a period certain. To do a little bit more work and a little bit more understanding on pieces of legislation that we may have questions on. So currently, right now, I think you're doing the right stuff. You're meeting with us. You're talking about the legislation. You're showing the support, not only from legislators but from activists across the Commonwealth on the importance of the bill. And I think that's an important piece of this. The piece is the continued conversation, the dialogue about the legislation, and I've always said this in my almost over 20 years of being in the building as an aide and as a House member, is that's what this is about. It's about a conversation. It's about continuing the conversation. So specifically, when you talk about little, pieces of the bill that you think would be broken up, et cetera, I think when it comes to a legislative document, it's about a discussion. And if this thing was this, particular conversation that we would have now, or the bill that we would have to move forward, that goes to Ways and Means, et cetera. That conversation continues, that debate continues. So myself and my co-chair, we've had a great relationship, and we're going to be meeting periodically throughout this week to get things done by next week, I assume, right, Senator?
Absolutely.
Is there anything you wanted to add, Senator Keenan?
No, I just quickly, I agree with everything that Chair Sarah said. This is a great opportunity for people to express how they feel about this legislation. And you'd be new as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing. I have to say that the level of engagement and the ability of people to express support and even opposition to certain pieces of legislation has been really impressive. I feel like we've gotten so much information from so many different people through our hearing process, from people who reached out in the committee, as the chair said, going out into the community to see different housing proposals. I've done a lot of that through the Gateway Caucus Group. So it's really effective. It has been really effective getting us to have a better understanding of the breadth and the depth of the problem of housing. Not that we were unaware of it, but it just gives it a very new focus for me anyway. And so this has been helpful. And I think people reaching out, as the chair had said, the next step, should these bills move out of some form of these bills, some of these bills as they move out, make their way to Ways and Means, the advocacy has to continue. Getting out of the committee with a favorable report doesn't guarantee anything. It just guarantees that it's moved on to another step, and it's still a couple of steps to get it before the Senate and before the House for action, so that then can go to the governor's desk. And
I would add to that, Jesse, is the fact that that's why advocacy is something that has to continue, regardless if you don't get the result you want. You need to continue that dialogue and talk about the importance of the legislation. Again, CHAPA has certainly provided us, with a lot of resources too, and a lot of information about this bill early on. So Representative Vargas and Senator Crichton, I like to give them a lot of credit, have worked tremendously hard to continue the conversation and to let folks in all different sorts of sectors within the legislature and in different interests how important this bill is to the Commonwealth as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely, and we're proud to be partners with CHAPA. I know they really helped get this bill and many others, going in this session in partnership with various legislators. So definitely want to mention that and thank them. As you may know, we've been working with our members to get them to ask their legislators to co-sponsor this bill as a step right now in showing support for this legislation. You may have received a few letters in your own offices, and I think we've gotten I think I last look around 250 letters sent to legislators around the Commonwealth. And so, I'll be talking a little bit more at the end about how folks on this call can participate in that if they haven't already, and we'll certainly remain engaged after the February 2nd deadline, to push on this and other legislation that does move forward, to get full vote in both chambers. I think a related question, one that came in earlier when someone registered, was around expectations for a second round of ARPA funding, and is there a possibility for housing production focused legislation that maybe doesn't move out of committee after February 2nd to be incorporated into that? Can you talk a little bit about the prospects there? Either one?
Yeah, I mean, well, first and foremost, at the end of the day, it's all about money, right? And there has been, I would say, some spirited debate in Washington, D.C. that hasn't necessarily led to an infrastructure bill coming this way. Our revenues are strong. The consensus revenue committee that was commissioned, that was convened, I don't think I correctly said that, consensus revenue hearing, I should say that, in December, suggested that, revenues were strong moving into the new year. We do have a very robust reserve right now in the Commonwealth, and we still have, I don't know the exact figure, Senator, you may know, left over on the first round of ARPA money that came to Massachusetts. It certainly will be a continued priority. I think one of the major issues, and I know you talked a little about keeping people in homes, especially during the pandemic, and supporting rental assistance, is that the Senator and I were just recently briefed, and from DHCD, et cetera, that ERAP is going to be running out in June. So that would mean mid-April, folks may not be able to sign up when that money is exhausted. On top of that, in April, the eviction diversion program, which helps landlords and renters work together to receive money and stay in their home, that will be sunsetting in April. So there's some serious conversations we're going to have about investments of money, which could be up around 200 to 250 million at that time, as well as reinstituting the Chapter 257 language. And the Senator and I have had a number of conversations with folks about this just recently.
Great, thank you. We absolutely need to focus on that, keeping people in their homes, making sure we have the funding for the programs that do that, ERAP, eviction diversion, et cetera. It's come up in the chat. It's not directly related, but since it's been a focus of the chat in this conversation, and is a bill that we have supported, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, TOPA, is also a way to help at least stabilize folks who can, either renters who can either figure out a way to purchase their rental building if it's being sold, with their neighbors, or give that opportunity to a housing authority or a nonprofit like a community development corporation. Just another way to help keep renters in their homes and stabilize. So definitely just wanted to put a plug in for that one.
Just so you know on that, Jesse, yeah. That legislation actually passed both branches last year, and the economic development bill was vetoed by the governor.
That's right. Yeah. So hopefully there can be some. Hopefully it still has some legs in this session, and can convince the governor in his final year in office, if it passes, not to veto it. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. In a couple minutes, we'll go to back to Cassie to get to some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A here. But before we do that, I wanted to sort of leave you with a final sort of more general question that was submitted when someone registered, that I think is an interesting one. And you both talked about how housing is such a major issue in the Commonwealth and in your districts right now. Mm-hmm. Someone did ask, what is the most common constituent call, email, et cetera, type of outreach that you receive about housing? However you want to answer that, would love to hear your response.
Certainly. Senator,
go ahead, fire away.
I would say, since, and things do differ, I have a couple interesting stories. So early on in my career, I was first elected in 2008, took office in 2009. I would say from like 2009 to about 2014, it was 40B. 40B was the issue that, the sort of boogeyman that folks in my district would be up in arms about on a regular basis when there were projects in development, especially in the region I am in. I represent the towns of Littleton, Westford, and Chelmsford, which is one of the more fastest growing high-tech regions anywhere in the Commonwealth. So there's a large sort of bedroom community for software engineers and folks that work in an industry. With a lot of build out, there was a lot of 40B projects that certainly got the most attention from a lot of my constituents at the time. That sort of paused over the last 4 to 5 years. And I think a lot of it is the work that the legislature and DHCD has done on incrementally reaching your 10% threshold through working with DHCD. But I would say this last 3 to 4 years, it's a whole host of issues. There's certainly issues with folks that need rental assistance. There's always folks that are very interested in zoning issues, whether that be 40B or additional zoning issues. Littleton's been a wonderful example of a town that's worked closely with their planning board and their local leadership on 40R issues. And so right now, housing choice, the regs were kicked out about a month ago, and there's still various seminars on webinars, if I should say, on educating folks about that. But I would say the MBTA community being Littleton, we're hearing a lot about that over the last month or so, 2 months, but it does vary.
Aaron, if I can, in my district, a lot of the same things of late. It has been issues of trying to keep people in their homes, provide them with the assistance that they need. And we've been very engaged and active in that. In the bigger picture in my district, and it's interesting to see kind of the differences in communities across the Commonwealth, 40B remains still an issue. And I look at 40B, here was a law that was put in place back in the 1970s with the idea that we would promote low and moderate income housing. And here we are some 50 years later, and we're all still struggling to reach that 10% threshold. And so it leads me to question, has the law worked as well as we'd like? And some would say that it's without it, we wouldn't have some of the affordable housing that we've been able to do. And others say that communities spend so much time trying to avoid the requirements of 40B. And on that point, just recently, one of my communities, there was a proposal to convert some existing housing into affordable housing. And some of the feedback from people was, that's great. That gets us closer to our 10%, where we then don't have to worry about 40B developments coming into our community. And right now, in at least 3 of my communities, there are 40B proposals that are drawing a pretty strong opposition. And in one, it's adjacent to a commuter rail station. In another, it is near more of a car transportation area as opposed to any public transportation. But interestingly, in each community, the areas have been generally zoned for multifamily. And in one of the communities, it was an area that was actually designated for multifamily use in the housing production plan. And so a developer comes in to propose a 40B, and the pushback is almost immediate. And that's consistent across my district. In Quincy, where I live, which has literally built thousands of units over the course of the last few years, there is definitely developing an anti-development sentiment. It was here back in, and I was involved in zoning in the city of Quincy back in the mid to late 80s into the early 90s, and it was there. It kind of petered out a little bit as the economy changed, and now with the housing production that has occurred, people are really pushing back, saying enough is enough. You're impacting the quality of our neighborhoods. So the real challenge is getting those people to understand that this is personal for them, that this is housing for their mother or their father as they transition, for their sisters, their brothers, their neighbors, their children who grow up in the community and want to stay in the community. It's housing for teachers, it's housing for DPW workers. And when you kind of put in those terms, some of the opposition comes down. But I think that's what we've been hearing an awful lot about in my district, and what one of the biggest challenges is to producing housing and maintaining affordable housing.
Yeah,
and I think I'll add to that, Jesse, just one thing, and I think the senator would think this is a little peculiar too, is that when we had our 40B hearing, I think it was our quickest hearing. What do we have, Senator? I think one speaker. I think we were there for like 15 minutes. It blew me away. And you think just 5-10 years ago, Gardner Auditorium was filled with all the various bills on 40B or abolishing 40B. And I think maybe that ballot initiative, I believe, was that 2010 or 2012?
I believe so. 2010, I believe.
It was 2010. Took a lot of the wind out of the abolishing 40B sales, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate you both bringing that up. You know, we support the 40B law, absolutely. You know, I think there's certainly questions around now more than 50 years after its passage. Why is it so difficult for some towns to reach 10%? And then, you know, in my former life as an affordable housing developer, I encountered communities, like you said, Senator, that were working to get to that 10% so that they could have safe harbor and didn't need to do anything else. And I sometimes felt, you know, a little bit dirty about that, just trying to help towns get to that so that they didn't have to build more, when we know that really 10% isn't a sufficient number in many, a sufficient proportion of affordable housing in many communities. So definitely we'll absolutely keep that on the radar moving forward, how we can strengthen that. And that's why I think it's important to see elements like, you know, under Rep. Vargas's bill, you know, a requirement in those multifamily districts for a certain percentage, whether 10 or 15% affordable housing in, you know, in those broader multifamily developments. So thank you for bringing that up. We're gonna transition to some of the Q&A with Cassie's gonna come back on and facilitate, and I'll invite Rep. Vargas to join us again, because I think some of the questions are relevant to him. And then, yeah, so I'm gonna turn off camera and leave it to Cassie to facilitate here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jesse. And thank you, Senator Keenan, Representative Arciero, and Representative Vargas. We're so pleased to have spent this hour with you and really appreciate your time. I think Abundant Housing's board president, Bea Jimenez, put it best in the chat. You know, we really just want to share our gratitude, and it's very refreshing to see our state legislators promoting actionable solutions to our housing crisis. So I think I just wanted to echo that gratitude that has really been shared in the chat as well. Hi, Rep. Vargas. So we have around 6 questions that have been submitted. And what I will do is, just to ensure that we can answer as many as possible here in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to combine a few of them that are similar or pertain to the same topic. And then if there are any questions that remain unanswered, what we will do at Abundant Housing is just maybe follow up or submit any additional comments or questions to the legislators and get back to attendees as best we can. And so this first question is related to 1448. And so Rep. Vargas, if you'd like to attempt or answer the question, feel free to, but I'd invite anyone else to just jump in as you see fit. And so this question is, there's 3 questions related to 1448. The first is, how did legislators decide on the 427,000 unit target by 2040? And how might those production goals be monitored and updated? And how does the ADU component relate to prior legislation? And the final question related to 1448 is, why only ask for multifamily zoning transit? The example was brought up that other states like California have done something a little bit more expansive in terms of zoning. So those questions were submitted by Oliver and Sally. Thank you both.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, and I'll let my colleagues, if they want to jump in on any of it, feel free to. But real quick on the California piece, look, you know, California banned single family zoning, right? And that's very ambitious, right? And while I might be in favor of that, I'll just be candid politically, I don't think we have the political capital for that in the Commonwealth at this point. And so I think we just have to be realistic about that here. This is still a very bold bill. There are a lot of bold provisions in this bill. And so what we did was, how do we walk right up to that line of being as bold as we possibly can while trying to get something done to advance the goal of more housing production? And that's sort of a similar answer to the 427,000 units. That is still a bold goal for us. And that number was sort of come up with, you know, in conjunction with advocates as well as folks in our office, and trying to come up with something that we thought was, yes, bold, but certainly doable, right? If we were aggressive about this. And then the third question relative to ADUs, candidly, I'm not sure how this currently relates to state law and ADUs. I know there's a hodgepodge of municipalities that have different rules and regs around ADUs. And so the goal would be to try to create some sort of standard to make sure that ADUs are allowed by right across the Commonwealth.
I think to jump onto that too, Representative, is and Senator, things that I had, had conversations with, like, I believe Kate, Hyannis's HAC group and Representative Diggs, et cetera, is that it's become difficult to have ADUs when you have to actually pull a special permit. And then there's sort of local reasons that things get tied up. And so therefore it becomes more difficult to actually have auxiliary dwelling units. And my understanding is in this bill, it would allow it as a right for communities, and that would, put forward additional housing opportunities.
And if I can just jump in to kind of expand on that, I had mentioned being on City Council in Quincy, some of the proposals that came before us for ADUs, and we see similar things being proposed in legislation that's before us. There's always the idea that they should be restricted perhaps to in-laws or people with disabilities. There's different categories, and it's really difficult to enforce that from a zoning perspective, a zoning enforcement officer to go in to determine who's living there. Are they a member of the family? Are they a person with a disability? Whatever the requirement may be specific to that community, it's very difficult to enforce, and particularly if there's a deed restriction relative to that type of housing, it's very difficult to enforce. So that leads to the alternative argument that you don't do those type of restrictions, you just make it accessory dwelling units, and without any sort of requirements as to who can live there. The other thing that has come up in the past is whether the accessory dwelling unit should be contained within the footprint of the building. Several years ago, there was a proposal in the legislature that focused on that, and that seemed to be something at the time that was more acceptable to legislators. Now the proposals, some of them before the committee and some that are out there in local communities, would be that you could have it within the footprint of the building. It could be connected to the building or directly adjacent to the building. They could range from 450 square feet up to 900 square feet per dwelling unit. And then one of the things that still is addressed in a couple of ways in some of the legislation and in some of the things that municipalities are looking at or have looked at in the past is the requirement of parking. And I think a couple of the bills that we have say that there shall not be a requirement for any more than one parking space, which suggests that there's a requirement for a parking space. And in some communities, that would basically preclude somebody from having an accessory dwelling unit. My street, 5,000 square foot lots, which I think all the legislation talks about 5,000 square foot lots, including 1448, 5,000 square feet or greater. 5,000 square foot lot, 50-foot frontage, 100-foot deep. You could probably work out the dimensions and reasonable bulk to add an ADU, but then what do you do with parking? If there's an additional space required, in Quincy, for instance, that would be in conflict with a front yard paving ordinance that's in place. So you wouldn't be able to accommodate the parking that's required. So all those things have to be looked at. And what's encouraging is that some communities are looking at this. Arlington, for instance, has adopted an accessory dwelling unit ordinance, and they're working through the mechanics of it now as it's implemented. And so, there's a lot out there on it, but certainly it's a piece of the housing puzzle.
And the other thing I'll just add on, that there was a question around, like, how do we make sure this data is public? The bill does have an enforcement mechanism and making sure that HED is reporting to the legislature annually on the progress made towards that goal. So I think that's just an important piece to mention. Just one thing I'll mention real quick before I forget that I think is important around sort of the context of sort of candidly the politics and culture around housing is that if we want to change the minds of constituents, of folks, of residents, of voters about this, we have to also educate people on how we count SHI. Subsidized housing inventory, the way we count it is overinflated, right? And so, if, for example, here in Haverhill, for example, we have a project that has 200 units in it. And because over 10% of the units are affordable, I think it's 11% are affordable, the whole project counts as an SHI project, right? And so we count every single one of those units as an SHI unit. And so therefore our SHI number, our subsidized housing inventory number for Haverhill, is technically above 10%. But we're counting a bunch of units that aren't technically affordable, right? And so if we had a real number, right, if we had a real number around SHI, we could have a different conversation with folks around, hey, you might think we're above, 10% or, that we're at, 12%. So we're good. It's on other communities to do their share. Whereas it's a different conversation if we actually have a raw number, a real number as to what the SHI is.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those details. And thank you so much, Rep. Vargas, as well, for addressing the banning of the California banning single family zoning, because that was actually a separate question that came up. So you answered like 5 questions in one. So we appreciate that. And so I'd like to ask the final question as a 2-part series here. And these questions were submitted by Jennifer and Jen. And I think this really speaks to Rep. Vargas. Earlier on in your introduction of 1448, you talked about addressing the housing crisis really as an opportunity for economic justice. And so Jennifer's asking, how do we ensure that people have broader access to the housing that's produced, so we do get economic justice without replicating those patterns of segregation? And thinking about sort of that history and the patterns of segregation, is it practical to address, the racist impact of single family zoning, specifically with your constituents? We talked a little bit about the impact and the need for housing for our seniors, et cetera. But do you think there's an opportunity to really address that specifically with your constituents? And thinking back to this first question of, how do we make this a broader economic justice issue and treat it as such?
Yeah, so I think, every housing project is an opportunity to educate constituents, residents, and officials at the local level. Here in Haverhill, for example, we have a project that's being proposed in our downtown for over 160 units. And as proposed, not a single one of them is affordable in downtown Haverhill. And so we're having the conversation now around, hey, we understand the need for market rate in gateway cities. We want to have, some more market rate housing, but to not have a single affordable unit in this project when housing is the #1 issue that we're facing right now is a missed opportunity, right? And we've had to do some educating around the fact that in Haverhill, 42% of residents qualify for some sort of affordable housing, whether it's affordable housing or workforce housing, some form of subsidized housing. Almost half the entire city qualifies for that. And so this isn't just a subset of the population that we're talking about. And so one of the things that we're doing, or my office is doing right now, is trying to advocate that project take advantage of a home ownership opportunity that we created with the Black and Latino Caucus, working with Governor Baker in mass housing. That program, the Commonwealth Builder, which Chairman Arciero mentioned earlier, that we put more money into during the American Rescue Plan debate, offers a good opportunity to address some of the racial inequalities when it comes to housing and intergenerational wealth. If we're able to, let's say in a 160 unit project, create 20, 30, 40, 50 units that are first time home buyer opportunities, we know that those are opportunities for us to get Haverhill residents into those units that can then build intergenerational wealth, build some equity into the rising tide that this project is going to bring to Haverhill without getting gentrified out, right? And so the idea is, yes, you want to bring new projects, new production, but how do you balance that new production and that economic growth in a manner that benefits people locally? And one of the most surefire ways to do that is to get people at the local level to be able to become the first-time home buyers so they can benefit from that equity and pass it on from generation to generation.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in, the representative raises some really good points about the challenges that different communities confront. And as I was traveling to many of the gateway cities, it was interesting that even within gateway cities, the need for different types of housing was pretty diverse. For instance, City Quincy, which is a gateway community that I represent, Commonwealth Builders Program, there really isn't a need for it, because when somebody builds a market rate unit, they're gone. And but tying in the affordability aspect is really important. As I mentioned, that project that was built on the parking lot at North Quincy, there's no affordability component to it. And a lot of the new development that's occurred in downtown Quincy, there has not been a requirement to build affordable or to contribute to the affordable housing trust that the city has. So we've got to get all communities back into thinking of that. And then when you look at a place like Fall River, what we heard from the development folks down there was that they're in desperate need of market rate housing. that through subsidized housing inventory or through naturally occurring affordable housing, they figured about 70% of their housing stock is affordable. And they want to bring in some market rate housing to help kind of spur the economy down there, to help the development of the downtown and make sure that it's as diverse a community as possible. One of the things I struggle with is that many communities are doing what they should do in terms of trying to promote market rate and affordable housing. They're facing some backlash and they're trying to struggle through that. Meanwhile, and this was brought up a little bit earlier, we have communities who really aren't interested in doing anything.
Mhm.
And it's a real question of whether they will ignore the MBTA communities legislation and just say that's fine, mass work grants don't need enough to us. And so how do we get those communities to participate in the housing equation? Part of me thinks, let them go. They're not near transportation hubs, as directly. They may be adjacent communities, or even in some places that have 40B required, that 40Bs aren't even proposed because they're not near transportation. And let them go. Maybe they should just contribute financially to communities regionally that are willing to do more housing. But then that leads to the issue of furthering kind of some of the segregation issues that we have. Do we really want to promote some communities that are not as urban as others with the idea that they don't have to participate and they remain, a single race community and everybody's denied access to those great school systems that they may have? So those are kind of the tensions that we have. I think a great model going forward is, and we have one in Quincy, is housing that is affordable, workforce, and market all in one. We had a development like that in Quincy in an area that's not really accessible to public transportation other than bus. It's a great development. It filled up quickly and it really filled a need in the community. And so I think looking at that combination is really important. So we really have to focus on all these broad types of housing because, if we don't, 20, 30 years from now, the housing picture, we may have more housing, but the look of our communities may be very much the same as it is now, and we won't take advantage of the opportunity to integrate people and make our communities healthier in so many different ways.
Thank you so much, Senator Keenan, Representative Arciero, and Representative Vargas, who I know just had to leave. And I want to be respectful of your time. That is the conclusion of our Q&A section. We are so deeply appreciative of your time in joining us today. We at Abundant Housing, our membership and our broader network will continue to be by your side advocating for this important legislation to make it through so that we can change that picture, as you mentioned, Senator Keenan, 20, 30, 40 years from now. To a more inclusive housing economy. And so with that, I will turn things over to Jesse to close our event for today.
Yes, thank you, Cassie. Thank you, Senator Keenan, Rep. Arciero, and Rep. Vargas. Really honored to have you join us today. And as I think Rachel Heller from CHAPA, who I just saw put in the chat, said, thank you for this thought-provoking conversation. I think it gives us a lot to focus on, for the remainder of this session and for sessions to come. And we look forward to working with you and the Housing Committee to move forward our agenda. As folks, as certainly the co-chairs know, February 2nd is that joint Rule 10 deadline for legislation to move out of committee. As I mentioned earlier, we're working to encourage our members and supporters to reach out to their legislators in support of our agenda, in particular to get them to co-sponsor 1448 and 871 in the Senate. I believe Cassie just added that link into the chat for anyone who wants to take action on that. Easy way to send a letter to your senator and representatives. So thank you, everyone in this call, for your commitment to building a Massachusetts that is for everyone with affordable and equitable housing in all communities. If you liked this event and you want to share it, please remember that we will have this up on our YouTube channel. We'll post it on our social media. Please forward it to other folks who may not have been able to join today. And then finally, Abundant Housing, we're not just a membership organization. We are our members. Our work is driven by the work of our members. So if you enjoyed this session, you found it thought-provoking and you want to become more involved, we encourage you to join as a member on our website. And I believe Cassie has put that link into the chat if she hasn't already. And here are ways that you can connect with us. And I believe that is all that I have on my agenda. I want to again thank the co-chairs for taking the time in their very busy schedule right now before that February 2nd deadline to join us. And we look forward to working with you, into the future. And thanks to everyone who participated on this call and for the thoughtful questions. Hope everyone